So my name is Marion Haberkamp. I'm head of the section of neurology psychiatry at B-Pharm in Bonn, and I'm also a member of the CNS Working Party. And usually we are the bad guys. We give all the restrictions you have to take into account. So I don't know why the slides don't come up. The next slide would have been my declaration of interest.
Coming up.
So there it is. Now it's coming up. So nothing to declare here, and all information discussed is publicly available. I will give you an overview of the content. First of all, I would like to highlight why we consider as regulators treatment-resistant depression still as an unmet medical need. I will shortly give you an overview of the European guideline on clinical investigations of medicinal products in the treatment of depression. And from a recent example in the main part, I will use possible implication on new therapeutic approaches, also that might also apply to psychedelics. And I hope I will... Yes, better? Okay, now better? Okay, and then I will, okay, thank you very much for pointing that out. And then I will hopefully conclude with a view to the future. So, Major Depressive Disorder is a serious disease. We all know that it's the leading cause of disability worldwide, according to WHO, and we have more than 300 million people worldwide affected, and up to 20% are considered as non-responders to standard antidepressants, unfortunately, and still. So you all probably are aware of the STAR-D algorithm pointing out treatment switches in case of non-response to treatments, which was already introduced by Rush, Trivedi and Faber in 2003, so a very old concept. And unfortunately, it revealed that there are challenges with TRD, that with increasing steps of switches, the treatment response is dramatically declining after step 2, at step 3 and 4, roughly about 13%, and that has also effects on the cumulative proportion of participants without relapse, which is also decreasing after 3 or 4 switches. And that led to, within the regulatory framework previously, to the definition of treatment-resistant depression, which has previously been considered as a failure of at least 2 different antidepressants from the groups of agents commonly used as first-line treatments. It could be of the same or a different class. We are quite open here, and they need to have been prescribed at an adequate dosage for an adequate duration and with adequate affirmation of treatment adherence. However, the current guideline revision is still ongoing. So, and I would like to highlight that we are getting more open here, that we acknowledge that TRD develops in a continuum with progressively higher resistance, depending on the number and nature of interventions failed. So it must not necessarily be 2, 3, or 4. So it's a continuum. But however, defining TRD as a failure of at least 2 different antidepressants is a conservative approach, and thus still considered to be appropriate. So this is about the guideline, the EMA depression guideline, which is work in progress by the CNS Working Party at EMA. So we are currently with revision 2, which is in operation and has been in operation since 2013. The current revision 3 is ongoing, unfortunately, due to the circumstances, the Brexit, the COVID-19 situation. The work got stuck. So hopefully we will resume work soon in fall to release a new draft of the guideline, which is in preparation and almost ready for external consultation. And what needs to be updated? Well, the update specifically addresses several aspects for trial designs in difficult-to-treat patients, including the definition and identification of those patients, and the role of augmentation and combination strategies and new approaches. and especially the clinical development requirements for new rapid-acting therapies. So this is already taken on board, and probably also the psychedelics. And the need to monitor the degree of suicidal thoughts and behavior, which is of key importance in this field, is highlighted again and confirmed. So what are the considerations concerning rapid-acting antidepressants that will be in the guideline? So they may be studied as monotherapy or in an add-on setting, and there are different scenarios that we can foresee, either as a monotherapy where the rapid-acting antidepressant is administered alone as an initiating therapy or replacing a conventional antidepressants. There might also be initiation of a treatment with a rapid antidepressant followed by maintenance treatment with a conventional antidepressant, or maintaining the conventional antidepressant and initiate treatment in an add-on approach followed by a maintenance dose. And each situation requires a different study design. As is the case in the general major depression indication, usually we require double-blind, randomized, parallel group, placebo-controlled clinical trials. And why placebo-controlled would be acceptable? Because we don't have actually licensed comparators in this field. So, nevertheless, depending on the mechanism of action, earlier efficacy endpoints might be acceptable, providing that also the sustainability of treatment response is characterized. The usual endpoints are administered at 4 to 6 weeks with the conventional antidepressants, but with the rapid-acting antidepressants that would no longer apply. And also here we are changing and changing the rules. So now I come to the recent examples. As you probably all might have expected, is the nasal esketamine, Spravato, the NMDA receptor antagonist, which has the indication treatment-resistant major depressive disorder in combination with a SSRI or an SNRI, and treatment resistance has been defined in this setting with patients who have not responded to at least 2 different treatments with antidepressants in the current episode. But it is also licensed for the rapid reduction of depressive symptoms, which constitute a psychiatric emergency. And here also co-administers with an oral antidepressant therapy. Here are an overview of the studies for licensing of esketamine. 5 completed phase 3 studies with this product, the short-term trials, the transforms trials, which had a similar design, one with a fixed dose, one with a variable dose, and also one study in elderly patients, which we consider usually very important since they respond differently to treatments. We have a maintenance of effect trial, which we usually require, and a long-term open label study. So roughly 1,800 patients got included. Nevertheless, as regulators, we were very much criticized by various stakeholders that we licensed this street use drug and party drug for medicinal purposes. Germany was the rapporteur at this time, and we found and could convince everybody in Europe that the benefit-risk ratio was positive due to the enormous and huge effects, and that the safety profile was controllable. So this is an example of a design for the short-term treatment, and which I would like to highlight here is what the company did. It was a prospective observation of non-response of an oral antidepressant. So not only recent treatment failures, but also they had a phase of prospective observation to define those patients. And this is something certainly which is crucial in this setting, but which is also a big hurdle to companies to set this up. And also here we are getting more open. I would like to highlight that a retrospective assessment of non-response could also be acceptable, provided it is in the patient chart and it can really be convincingly deduced. But then patients were switched and re-randomized to the double-blind phase with the intranasal esketamine plus a new oral antidepressants, and on the other arm the intranasal placebo plus the active comparator antidepressant, and this was a 4-week treatment period with a follow-up period of 24 weeks, and they feed it into, among others, also patients were recruited newly in this relapse prevention study, which we usually require to establish maintenance of effect. So the companies have to conduct a randomized withdrawal study where non-responders are, after an induction phase and an optimization phase, which is quite long, are then re-randomized to intranasal esketamine continuous treatment or to intranasal placebo, and this also on the add-on setting. So this is something which you usually require as a maintenance of effect study. So the results of the short-term studies were quite convincing. Here is an overview, which is also published, of the TRANSFORM trial after 28 days, 4 weeks of treatment, huge treatment effects, but which also, and that is interesting, started at a very early time point. So a rapid onset of effect in this treatment. And now I come to the studies for the other indication, the short-term treatment of psychiatric emergency due to major depressive disorder, the ASPIRE studies. They had 450 patients, a little bit less number, and this is an overview of the study profile. Patients were identified as being at a psychiatric emergency by a certain questionnaire, and then in the inpatient psychiatric unit, the double-blind treatment phase started, and patients were followed up to 28 days and had also a follow-up phase. Here, the primary endpoint was at 24 hours. So it was a different primary endpoint, not a usual 4 or 6 weeks. It was at 24 hours after the first dose, and the change in MADRS was statistically significant. And the interesting thing you can see here in the graphs that also the placebo group had an enormous treatment effect. So that was probably because due of the very close caring in the psychiatric unit the patients had, the very close intervention with the therapists. Nevertheless, the active treatment on top of antidepressants had still huge treatment effect, and it was luckily still statistically significant, so that convinced us that this indication should be licensed. However, the key secondary endpoint, which was a change on the suicidal scale, the CGI-SSR, which got newly invented by the company and got validated by the company, was not statistically significant. And that had, of course, implications on the indication. So in Europe, we don't have for the rapid reduction of suicidality, because this was in fact not shown, but for the rapid reduction of depressive symptoms in emergency patients. And that explains how we worded the indication, which is slightly different from the FDA. So what were the additional important characteristics of study designs? Of course, when we talk about an intranasal drug which has a dissociative effect, we have to think about blinding. And that's also, of course, refers to the psychedelics. How can blinding be ensured? This is a very important point. In this case of Spravato, we had independent blinded remote telephone MADRS assessment. There were twice weekly visits with high interactions with clinicians due to the safety concerns. And to minimize bias, the protocols required that different raters perform the efficacy and the safety assessment. Remote raters and different raters. And in addition, the esketamine and placebo nasal spray devices used in the phase 2 and 3 studies were indistinguishable, and a bittering agent was added to the placebo solution to simulate the taste of the esketamine solution. Overall, regulators found that the efforts to minimize the risk of a potential effect on blinding were considered sufficient, and so we didn't have so much concerns on this approach. So efficacy is one part of licensing, but the adverse event profile is the other part to establish a benefit risk. Here are highlighted, of course, you are aware of that, the profile of esketamine, just mentioned dissociation, anxiety, increased blood pressure, and that has, of course, an implication on the monitoring schedule. How long needs to be monitored, and this influences post-authorization measures, the risk management plan, the pharmacovigilance plan, and how this is all set up. And this is also described in the SMPC, because at licensing time point, we never know how is the long-term effects. because we only have a very limited view on the treatments. The short-term studies are restricted, the studies are half a year, but what happens after that? So the summary of product characteristics and the package leaflet includes a statement that this medicinal product is subject to additional monitoring, and that will allow quick identification of new safety information. So, and this statement is preceded by an inverted equilateral black triangle. So specific safety monitoring has to be undertaken, and in the posology there are some specific indications that the treatment has to be determined by a psychiatrist, somebody who is familiar in the field, under the direct supervision of a healthcare professional. Has the self-administration be applied, and there is a post-administration observation period that should be carried out in appropriate clinical setting. And there are also monitoring recommendations for the assessments before treatment. Blood pressure is in the key interest. There were some blood pressure crises developed, and also post-administration observation is highlighted. So it should be reassessed at approximately 40 minutes and subsequently as clinically warranted. And it is clearly stated that the possibility of sedation, dissociation, and elevated blood pressure must be monitored by a healthcare professional until the patient is considered clinically stable. So lots of responsibility is here given to the treating physicians. We say 40 minutes has to be observed, but then the physician has to determine how long the necessity is really required. So now we come to new drug developments, new challenges for regulators since the psychedelics take flight. These are the developments. I find the graph quite interesting, how many studies are being conducted in the recent years, and can all this be transferred, what we learned from Spravato or esketamine? It is not a controlled drug, Spravato. Nevertheless, it has some dissociative effects and some street use potential and abuse potential. So can this be transferred? And above all, there's always the question, is there an obstacle from a regulatory perspective? Do we have concerns because the psychedelics are listed in Germany in Annex 1 of the German Narcotic Act as a non-marketable? This is a little bit a view to the history. Albert Hoffman, who described LSD as a problem child, but hopefully would expect that it can become a wonder child. Then we have the turmoil around Timothy Leary in the 60s and 70s, nicely described in this book I just pointed out in the middle. And we have, of course, the increasing interest not only in science but also in art on these types of drugs. And to answer the question if there's an obstacle from a regulatory perspective, I would point out no, because the Federal Institute of Drugs and Medical Devices may grant a permit for scientific purposes or other purposes in the public interest. And here there's the clear hint that, of course, there's the unmet medical need, and if there is proof that this works in these unmet medical needs situation, there's a justification, and that is outlined in Article 3.2 of the German Narcotic Act. So that might be different in other countries, but I speak from a German perspective, and therefore it's very important what we heard in the previous talk that we get together on one table and see what can be done for these kind of licensing procedures. So, and here you can see that there's a screenshot from clinicaltrials.gov. I just did it for psilocybin, but it could have also been done for MDMA. So here you can see lots of trials that have been approved, and some of them are also within the remit of the clinical trials department at BfArM. So lots of things are going on here, and this is something which I would like to discuss now, and maybe the most important slides. What should be defined and justified for psychedelics? Well, important is the population definition, since it is always a benefit-risk evaluation if you don't do so much about how this works in patients and if it is a new approach. So the worse the patient, the worse the population is, or the more the patient population is in need, the more regulators would be open to have a look at these drugs. And And I just used the example of TRD, since I deduced it from Spravato, but there might be other indications as well, like the post-traumatic stress disorder, as we just heard. So we recommend that the discussions taken into account for TRD, taken into account the discussions in the field, subgroup analysis by the number of previous failed treatments are considered useful and important to justify the severity of the populations. And with respect to treatment-resistant depression, also retrospective assessment of treatment failure is possible. And now, an important point is the setting. Add-on to conventional antidepressants might be problematic for psychedelics due to the counteracting effects, but psychotherapy or psychological support is important, and it has to be worked out. Is this only for safety purposes, or if this is an integral part of the therapy? And then it has to be standardized, and we need to see this standardization and the training of the psychologists and the setting, and this has to be described and will then probably be integral part also of the indication. The comparators are important, placebo or active. Not so much licensed in these indications, or not so much for a long time, so we don't have an established treatment. So here but the payers usually want to have and to see something in this context. So we recommend early HTA interaction, and that is really crucial and important. The monitoring is important, not only on the acute effects, but also on potential long-term effects, the possibility of prolonged psychosis or distraction disorders, and the risk minimization measures have to be defined, and PAS and PAES studies probably, and registries might be a way out of this to do a post-marketing observation. Then the timing, yes? 5. Okay, the timing of the primary endpoint is important, and then one thing which is crucial is the maintenance of effect. And here, alternative study designs for products that are only given once or twice are needed. This is acknowledged. So nevertheless, the need for retreatment should be investigated, and it is clear that the product that is given, for example, psilocybin, will have a different benefit-risk profile if the time interval when the antidepressant is reintroduced is very short compared to a very long time interval when a conventional antidepressant has to be given. And all this will have implications in the essence MPC. So this is just something about the central authorization. So the marketing author, there are certain areas of therapeutic treatment where centrally authorized products have to be submitted, and also in case of new active substances and new therapeutic fields, the centralized procedure is a way forward, according to my opinion. So what can be offered? Early involvement of regulators at Innovation Task Force or scientific advice. And this is just an overview of scientific advices at EMA in 2020. So the nervous system field has quite a big role, 82%, as you can see on this slide. This is a more granular overview. The left graph shows that early HTA, that we have combined HTA scientific advice procedures at EMA. And now I come already to my conclusions with a view to the future. So regulators are open to evaluate new therapeutic approaches in areas of unmet medical need, that is clear. And even if medicinal products are listed as controlled drugs, studies are possible. So no obstacle from our point of view. Regulatory guidelines are constantly adapted and updated if scientifically reasonable, and we are in this process. And appropriate risk evaluation and mitigation strategies supported by data need to be developed, and also in the post-marketing setting. And I would encourage scientific advice either at EMA level or national level, and early dialogue. This is recommended and probably helpful to get on one table and to discuss the best way forward to get these drugs approved. So thank you very much for your attention, and hopefully, yeah, it's 25 minutes.
For 5? Hello. Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Haberkamp. So we are I don't know if we're in a comfortable situation, because is Oza and Polat here in the room, who would be the next speaker? He is not. So if he is not coming, we have half an hour of spontaneous questioning or panel. So, but even if he's coming, we have space for a few questions. So, Gerd, please.
Yeah, thank you for your very helpful talk. On one of your first slides, you had the unmet medical need for treatment-resistant depression. When we planned our study, which was on your slide, so it's running, we consulted with BfArM and we got the feedback that we should, looking for the right indication, we chose treatment-resistant depression because there's an unmet medical need. Now, retrospectively and prospectively, I think there's also an unmet medical need in major depression, not treatment-resistant, because I don't think that what we have currently available is really sufficient for everybody. So we need different treatments even for first episode patients. Could you imagine approving a study in first episode depression with a psychedelic?
Oh, well, I think this we are open here. Nevertheless, I would in this setting I would recommend a staggered approach to see if it first works in the most serious affected patients, and if this is the case, if this can be demonstrated, and probably it will be demonstrated, I think there could be a way forward to establish it in a broader population, because we all know that the treatment response of conventional antidepressant therapies is also not very good at step 1 and step 2. I highlighted step 2, 3, and 4 on this STAR-D algorithm, but we all know that the response rate is also not so good in the other steps.
Quickly, before Chuck is asking a question, could you briefly explain to the American audience and everybody who is not living in the EU, what is the real relationship between the national approval authorities and the EMA? And then Chuck.
Yes, in Europe, we have different licensing procedures. Each country has its own national competent authority where we regulate the drugs that are on the respective markets. But when it comes to drugs, and that is was a little bit a slide. Maybe I might have, because of the time constraint, might have been a little bit too quick upon. There are certain areas where licensures has to become centralized from the European Medicines Agency, and that are usually the fields of HIV, neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer, all these drugs that are in development to diabetes and of course inflammations and cancer and these advanced therapies. These are have to be centrally authorized. That at the EMA, several national authorities have to come to one table, and then the rapporteurs are usually chosen from one of the national competent authorities in Europe, usually two, a rapporteur and a co-rapporteur, and then they will do the assessment, and in the end it will be a committee decision at the CHMP at the European level if this product gets licensed, and then it will go to the European Commission. So that is usually the way how it works. Very complicated process, but we have lots of experience with this, and this works well. Germany was rapporteur for Spravato, so that's a good example for us. And I think also the psychedelics should be not only nationally authorized, because they are of a European interest, and there should be a combined effort. And that is something which you can justify. Depression is not a neurodegenerative disease per se. Also, there could be some point there, and some antidepressants got centrally authorized, which is the vortioxetine and other antidepressants. So, where you can do a justification that this has to be under the centralized procedure, and that is the EMA, and the EMA works pretty much the same. I think as the FDA, it's central for Europe, and we have also the platforms to discuss. We have the ITF meetings, we have scientific advices where we accompany, we have the prime procedures where a product which is of specific interest, where you at a very early development step contact with the regulators, and where you are accompanied already right from the beginning in phase 2 planning by the scientific advice constantly, and you can get and have a constant dialogue. So these possibilities are are there and should be made use of. So I would like to a little bit advocate this, that you use these platforms and that you have early dialogue for these important developments.
Okay, hey, 2 quick questions, sort of separate from each other. The first is, so Usona, of course, is pursuing MDD, not TRD. Were it to be shown, say, in a phase 2 study that there was a strong signal for regular old MDD, would that influence the agency's sort of thinking about whether that might be possible, per Gerd's question? Second question, do y'all have some kind of cut point where the requirements for us in total are different in terms of duration, durability of effect? So, if people need to be dosed on average every 7 months, is that different than every 3 months, or is it a continuous thing? Yeah.
Yeah, to the first question, that is about what happens if in phase 2 something is shown, as strong signal is shown in general MDD, not in TRD MDD. Well, of course, this is something which could lead to a phase 3 planning. If we could have a look at these results, and if you see really strong and convincing effects, so why not? I would say, but that would be, of course, we have to have a close look then at the phase 2 trial data. And then with respect to the long-term need for studies, well, it is, of course, if you say it is one treatment session or at least a second treatment session, which is totally different to what we have now on the market, where antidepressants are given daily and the time when they have to come into effect is 2 weeks. 4 weeks, and this is different with the rapid-acting antidepressants, but also might be different with psychedelics, and therefore, of course, you cannot do the classical maintenance of effect trial with a drug that is only given once or twice. But nevertheless, we would like to have characterized what happens after that. How our patients then need to be treated. Do we have to give it continuously in a regulatory fashion, or do we switch to a common antidepressant, or do they need nothing after that? Are patients then in remission? So, and that is something which would really influence the benefit-risk profile of the licensing. And if you could then establish that you have a very long treatment period, 6 months, where you don't need to reinitiate a standard antidepressant, that would be really a strong, convincing effect. And so we suggest that is characterized.
Thank you very much.